I want to look at it through the lens of a different biblical character today. I want to look at it through the life of a guy named Paul. And last week, Pastor Brian's message, he gave us the perfect segue into this message because he talked about a little bit about Saul. And if you've been in church long enough, you know Saul and Paul they're the exact same guy. And basically, there was a huge divide in his life because he lived one way previously. It was really bad, and that was Saul. And then he totally changed his mind, and that's when he became Paul. He totally had a new way of thinking. And have you ever just had a total life shift before, a total change of mind? It doesn't happen very often. We tend to be pretty stuck in our ways. But I remember this one time that I had this total change in the way I saw things. And it all goes back to when I was 13, 14 years old. My friends and I, we would ride our BMX bikes all over the place. And so BMX bikes are the bikes that you do the tricks on and stuff. We weren't really good at the tricks, but we would just ride all over the city. We'd ride to church, ride to get snow cones. I mean, just all over the place, right? And so we're pretty good at riding bikes after a while. And then my friend BJ one day, some of you guys know BJ, he started talking about doing this thing called the MS-150. And he said, you guys like to ride bikes, right? Like, let's do this. The MS-150 is a bike ride from Houston to Austin. It's 150 miles. And I was like, all about it, right? Let's go. Let's do it. He's like, all right, cool. But first, if we're going to do this, we're going to need to find a way to get some road bikes. And I was like, we don't need a road bike. That's the bike that's made for doing the long distance stuff. I was like, we don't need a road bike because we have our BMX bikes that we ride. We ride them all the time. Like, we got this. And he was like, I don't think that the BMX bike is going to be a good idea around mile 25 when you're really hurting. I was like, BJ, I've already done the math, man. Like, I've got this. If we just ride at 7.5 miles an hour for 10 hours, and the MS-150 is 2 days, like, we got it. It's easy, right? No brainer. And he was like, why don't you just go try to ride 10 miles and then tell me how you feel? And so I did that. And after I did that, I realized, you know what? I don't think I want to ride 150 miles on my BMX bike. And so went out, bought a road bike. I did the MS-150 with BJ, and it was one of the most challenging things that I've ever done in my life. And after we finished, and we're in Austin, and we're celebrating and everything, I just kind of thought back to my previous way of thinking, where I thought I could do it on the BMX bike. And when I look at that version of little Evan who thought that would be a good idea, I just realized, I'm like, Evan, you were really, really dumb. Good thing you changed your mind, right? And so I had a mind shift on the way that I saw things. And that's kind of what happened to Paul. Because Paul was previously Saul, and he was really, really hung up on this way of life where he believed that following the Old Testament laws and the sacrifices and the rituals, that was what pleased God. And he thought that the Christians who were worshiping Jesus were really just making God mad, because these Christians who worship Jesus, they're just kind of not doing the Old Testament sacrifices and rituals and all following every little step. They're kind of just worshiping Jesus. And when Paul saw that, he's like, man, these guys, like Paul was trying to avoid this Old Testament curse, right? He didn't want the curse to be extended. And he says, the way that these Christians are living, well, they're going to make God really mad. And so we need to not let them do that. And so the best way to do that, what God would want us to do, is he would want us to just go ahead and kill these Christians and eliminate them, right? And so that's what Paul did. Well, not Paul, it was Saul at the time. And he was really good at it. He was high ranking in Judaism. He was one of the top guys, and that was his job. And so one day he gets word about this church that's, they're kind of becoming this really big gathering of Christians who are worshiping Jesus. And it's in the city that's called Damascus. And so Saul says, you know what, we got to go wipe out the Christians in Damascus. So he starts heading that way with every intention on killing the Christians there. And on his way there, you know how the story goes, he has something weird happen because Jesus shows up. And when Jesus showed up, things got a little out of hand. And he, after a few days, he realizes kind of what has happened, and he changes his mind. He realizes that the Christians who are worshiping Jesus actually have it right, that Jesus is the Son of God. And so he changes his mind. He has a mind shift. In my case, I no longer believed that I could do the MS 150 on my BMX bike, though I'm sure somebody has done it out there. In Paul's case, he no longer believed that Christians had it wrong. And so he kind of writes about his new life and his old life in Philippians 3. And he says, "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ." And he said there's just surpassing worth in knowing Jesus. And Paul really, after that happened, he became obsessed with this idea of knowing Jesus. And he made it his whole life goal. Like, if I can just know Jesus, like really, really know him, then I'm going to start seeing things the way that Jesus sees things. I'm going to start seeing people the way that Jesus sees people. I'm going to start treating people the way that Jesus treats people. I'm going to start being his hands and feet. Before you know it, I'm going to be just like Jesus. And so he said, that is going to be my number one mission in life. And then a few verses later, verse 14, he says, "And so I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus." He said, I'm just going to keep pressing on towards this goal. What's the goal? The goal is knowing Jesus. And he says he's going to keep his eyes upward. He's going to keep his eyes focused on heaven. For, you know what? While I'm on earth, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to get to know Jesus. But it's really not going to come to its culmination until the day that I step into heaven and I see Jesus face to face for the first time. And we hug and we embrace. And at that moment, when I finally meet him, that it will be the perfect knowledge, the perfect intimacy. You know, he'll finally fully know Jesus. And he says, until that day comes, like, I'm just going to keep my eyes focused on that goal, on that prize. And Paul oftentimes, like, he would refer to this while you're on earth, he would refer to it as running the race. Like, run the race for God, right? And that was Paul's goal. He's like, I'm just going to keep running this race. I'm going to keep my eyes on the prize, and I'm just going to keep going. And Paul, he ran well. He ran a good race. And, you know, we can compare that to, like, what is running a race like? Have you ever run a race before? Like, maybe you used to be in cross country or track. You may have signed up for a 5K or, had a race with a friend in a swimming pool or whatever. I wouldn't try me, just saying. After we did the MS 150, BJ said, okay, it's time for us to do some competitive racing now. And I was like, okay, what does that look like? And he said, well, let's do a triathlon. And so I said, what's a triathlon, right? He said, it's a big, long race where you swim, you bike, and you run. And so, your boy is all about it. Let's do it. Sign me up, right? And so I thought it'd be easy money. And so BJ tells me to sign up for this certain triathlon. And so I signed up for it, and I texted BJ, and I said, hey, signed up for the triathlon. I'm ready to go. I'm excited about it. Let's do it. And he texted me back, and he said, turns out I'm not going to be able to make this one. Good luck, though. And I'm like, BJ, my man, I've never done a triathlon. I have no idea what to expect. And so it's a little frustrating. He's like, oh, you'll do great. You got this. And I'm like, okay, here we go. I show up for the triathlon, and it just so happens that it's like the biggest triathlon in Texas. There's like thousands of people there. People have traveled from Alaska. They're all professionals. They all know what they're doing. And here I am, like, asking all these questions, like, where do I get the number? And, like, how did you pin it on there? Like all these little things, right? I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I find my way over to the start, and it turns out that we're going to be swimming in the ocean. So we're starting on the beach, and they kind of give an announcement over the speaker. They're like, to avoid shark attacks, swim with the group. I'm like, what did I sign up for, right? And so then they're like, the race is starting in 10, 9. And I'm looking around and I'm like trying to figure out what to do. Like, I'm lost. I've never done this thing before. 5, 4. I'm like, and nobody else is doing that. I'm like, oh, here we go. Okay. They say go, start swimming. It's really hard to swim when the waves are, it wasn't like swimming in the pool that we trained in. It was a lot different. And I kind of look up, I can't see, and I realize I'm kind of not with the group. They're all kind of leaving me. And I'm like, guys, we're supposed to swim in a group so we don't get eaten, But I survived. I outswim the sharks, I guess. But then I get on the bike. And I trained in the swim, and I trained on the bike. But what I didn't train for was getting on the bike after I swam. And I realized that those are two completely different things. And somehow it's hard to explain. Whenever I was on the bike, it felt like my stomach was behind me, and my legs weren't working. And so it was just a big challenge, right? And so we're going on the bike, and it kind of takes us on the seawall. And so, of course, you're looking out at people enjoying the nice day on the beach, and they're just sitting there relaxing, and I'm just riding by, dying, and I'm like, man, I wish, But, I'm making it, and it's tough, but I'm just kind of in a groove, and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna survive. But then it starts kind of getting hard because when we had to turn around, now the wind's in our faces, and things are getting harder, and I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I think I just kind of want to quit. And so I'm struggling, I'm sweating, I'm crying a little bit, and, whenever you do a triathlon, they put your age on the back of your calf here. And it was at that moment when I was at my weakest that this girl passed me up, and the age was 7. And so I'm on the bike, and I just get passed by a 7-year-old girl. And then this old guy comes up next to me, and he's like, you doing all right, youngster? And I'm like, well, buddy, you're like 89 years old, and I just got passed by a 7-year-old girl. I barely escaped the sharks. Like, no, I'm not doing all right, okay? I'm not okay. I hate this. Like, I'm ready for this to end. Why did I sign up for this? And it was a struggle, right? It's my first triathlon, but made it to the finish line. Almost died after I was done, but I survived. But the point is, on the race, there was a lot of trials, a lot of struggles. It's not easy, right? And in Paul's race of life, after he had that experience where he became Paul and he realized that the Christians were living right, well, life didn't get just super easy for him. And he writes about that in 2 Corinthians 11. And he says, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. And all that could have stopped if he would have just stopped talking about Jesus. And I read that and I just think, Paul, my man, what's wrong with you? You had this nice life where you were on top of the world. You were high ranking in Judaism. You had infinite wealth. You were famous. People liked you. You could snap your fingers and order people to do something. You could snap your fingers and people would give you whatever you wanted. I mean, you had the good life. And you traded all that in to be shipwrecked, pelted with rocks and stones. Like, what's wrong with you? This is not logical. This is insane. Who does this with their life? Paul, you've gone mad, Paul. And I think, if Paul were here today, we could ask him, we could sit down with him, right? And say, Paul, just be honest with us. Was it worth it? Losing that good life for all of that struggle and heartache? Let me ask you this, Paul. Was Jesus worth it? Or better yet, is Jesus worth it for us? And I think if Paul were here now, I think that he would say, is Jesus worth it? Yeah, Jesus is worth it. Because you see, it doesn't matter what we go through. Jesus gave up his life for us. Even bigger than that, Jesus gave up his spot in heaven and came down to earth for us. So the only appropriate response for us would be for us to give up our lives for him. I'll never forget, I was eating lunch with Brian one day here at work, and we went to the restaurant, and we're talking to the waiter, about Jesus and stuff, and not that we do that all the time, but it comes up, and the waiter says, he's like, oh yeah, I love Jesus because I don't have to do anything. He did everything for me. And Brian said, he's like, he did everything for you, and now he wants everything from you. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, this is what Paul says. He says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. He says, follow my example. Do the things that I do. We've talked about that a little bit. And are we ready to tell people to imitate us and to do what we do? Maybe in some areas of life, but I'm not ready to make that claim right now, But I think that it would be a really good idea for us to take Paul's advice here, to follow his example, to do the things that he did. And so how do we do that? What is Paul's example? Well, this weekend, the students have been learning about surrender. And I think Paul gave us a great example when it comes to the topic of surrender, because I think that he really surrendered his life well. And what I want to do is I just want to look at 4 things real quick that Paul was able to surrender and see how we can maybe follow Paul's example in that and imitate him. And so we'll just do these real quick. 4 areas of surrender that Paul gave up. Number 1, Paul surrendered his stuff. We already talked about how he was powerful. He was high-ranking in Judaism. He pretty much had the things that he wanted. And you can just imagine that whenever he had that moment where it's going to be Jesus or my stuff, I'm going to give up all of this nice life. You have to weigh those options. And Paul probably had a lot of stuff, a lot of things, a lot of material things. And that's hard to let go of. It reminds me of the story of the rich young ruler in Matthew 19. And he comes to Jesus. He wants to follow Jesus, but what he really wants, he doesn't really want to follow Jesus. He just wants to get into heaven. And so he comes to Jesus. He's like, what do I have to do to get into heaven? And Jesus says, well, go sell all of your stuff, get rid of your possessions, and then come follow me. Rich young ruler says, oh, well, never mind then, I guess. And it says that he went away sad because he had great wealth. He had a lot of stuff. And it's hard to give up our things sometimes. But how small are our things in light of eternity? How willing should we be to surrender these things? If you ask the people in this room, what's the one item that you can't live without? A lot of us are going to say our iPhone. A few of us are going to say your Android. But those people, they won't even surrender that phone for a phone that's better anyway, so why should we expect? Okay. Getting people mad at you. Stuff. I don't want to be so in love with things that I miss out on something that God is doing in my life, or something that God wants. He wants to take me deeper, but stuff gets in the way. How small are those things compared to the greatness of God? And Paul surrendered his stuff, but it wasn't just small stuff. Paul gave up significant stuff. Paul basically gave up his place to sleep because he spent his life traveling and telling people about Jesus and in the open sea, and he spent nights in prison, and he gave up his bed. Would you be willing to follow God if it meant giving up your Tempur-Pedic? I mean, we like our bed, right? And Paul's able to give that up. He gave up all of his comfort, all of his things, because those things had to go in order to fully surrender his life to Jesus. So Paul surrendered his stuff. Number 2, Paul surrendered his status. And this might be even more difficult than giving up our stuff because we like to have good status, right? And this is true in so many different areas of life. We like to have a good status with our job. We like to have good relationship status, We like it, on Facebook when it says relationship status in a relationship. With the teenagers these days, it's all about Instagram and Twitter, and instead of saying in a relationship, it says taken in all caps. Sometimes there's a heart, sometimes there's an anchor or a lock or something. But they want the world to know that I have relationship status. The problem is that a lot of us are more excited and more obsessed with our relationship status than we actually are with a relationship. Hello, right? Woo. I'm getting a little passionate up here. But it's hard to surrender our status. And, my Instagram bio used to have my status in it. It was like, in high school, starting varsity catcher for HCYA, right? Like, nobody cares. But then you graduate, and it's like, whoa, what am I now? Like, former starting varsity. Like, Evan, no one cares, Evan. Like, it's not a big deal. But Paul had to surrender his status. And, we've talked about he was high-ranking in Judaism. He was famous. People knew him. People looked up to him. People respected him. But when you start fighting for the other team, well, you lose that status. And people don't look up to you anymore. People look down on you. And instead of being respected, well, you're kind of mocked. And I can only imagine how the people of Judaism, the other Jews, the other officials, how they must have made fun of Paul and poked at him. And they probably laughed about it around the table with each other, saying like, man, that dude, he got himself thrown in prison again. What a lunatic, right? Why would he give up everything he had to go? He's gone crazy. He's gone mad, and they probably just mocked him. And Paul had to give up a lot of fame, a lot of attention, a lot of authority. He gave up his power and authority. He lost all the status that he had. But for Paul, well, if my status is going to get in the way of my relationship with Jesus, well, then I'll just go ahead and give that up. I'll just go ahead and step out of the spotlight and put Jesus in the spotlight. I would rather just be a nobody. And so for us to truly follow Paul's example and to truly imitate him as he has commanded us to do, I think that we need to really think about what area of my life do I need to be willing to surrender my status in. Surrender your stuff, surrender your status. Number 3 is that Paul surrendered his sin. And I feel like whenever I say those words that you're probably thinking like, well, duh, his sin was killing Christians, and so it's not that hard of a thing to give up. But, you may be thinking like, I would give up my sin if it was that easy, but I'm tempted on all these different ways, and it's really hard, and it's a struggle, and it definitely doesn't kill somebody whenever I sin. And if it were as easy as just not killing somebody, well, then I would surely give that up. So how am I supposed to surrender my sin like Paul did? Well, I want to explain this to you because it's really important, is that this was not just a temptation that Paul dealt with. This was how he was raised. He grew up believing that that God had expected people to follow these Old Testament rituals and sacrifices and recognize seasons and celebrations and all these rules. And that certainly served its purpose for a time.